The late afternoon drifted slowly across the quiet hills of Lake Wanaka, where Helen Mirren, now 76, sat alone in a room washed in the pale gold of a fading sunset. The dim light brushed gently across her seasoned face, where every line seemed to hold a chapter of a life filled with brilliance, and with silences too heavy to be spoken aloud. On the old wooden table before her lay black and white photographs, faded scripts, and a small bracelet she had kept for many years, fragile relics of a journey lived under both spotlight and shadow. Helen did not look at them. Her gaze remained fixed on the empty space before her, as though memories were slowly rising from it, heavy and deliberate, like dusk settling over the surface of the lake. Helen Mirren, the woman who had astonished the world with her strength, dignity, and ageless beauty, suddenly appeared different. There was something in the stillness of her posture that made one understand. Even the strongest souls carry wounds no applause can heal. She drew a long breath, her fingers trembling slightly, as if touching a door of memory she had spent years refusing to open. And then, in a low, slow voice, so soft it sounded like she was speaking only to herself, she said the words that made the entire room grow colder. "There are 5 people I will never forgive. No anger, no bitterness, only a truth, bare and unhurried, falling into the silence like a stone touching the surface of still water. 5 faces, 5 histories, 5 shadows time could not erase. But who were they? And why, after a lifetime of brilliance, did their names still haunt her in silence?" Long before the world knew her as an icon, Helen Mirren was simply a girl growing up in post-war London, surrounded by the quiet resilience of a family trying to rebuild a life in a world still healing from its wounds. She was born Helen Lydia Mironov, the daughter of a Russian father and an English mother, raised between 2 cultures, 2 temperaments, and 2 very different ways of understanding pain. Her father, a man of discipline and dignity, carried his own unresolved silences from a past he rarely spoke about. He was loving, but firm, a pillar whose presence often felt like a lesson she had not yet learned. Her mother, by contrast, embodied warmth and unspoken sorrow, the kind that lives in women who endure too much yet break too little. From her, Helen inherited tenderness. From her father, the instinct to hide it. As a child, she often felt like she lived on the threshold of 2 worlds, inside enough to observe, outside enough to feel the coldness of distance. School was no refuge. She was shy, attentive, inwardly bright but outwardly guarded. The other children saw her as different, too quiet, too intense, too thoughtful for the carefree simplicity expected of girls her age. And in the quiet corners of her early life, Helen developed a habit she would carry forever. She remembered everything. Words that hurt more than they should have. Glances that lingered a second too long. Moments that carved themselves into her heart with surprising sharpness. Yet it was also during these years that Helen fell in love with performing. On small wooden stages in drafty school halls, under weak lights and scratchy curtains, she discovered a place where she could breathe freely. Acting was not escape. It was revelation. It was the only space where she could feel deeply without apology. But the same sensitivity that shaped her artistry also left her vulnerable. She trusted easily, cared sincerely, and believed in the goodness of people long before she learned that goodness sometimes breaks without warning. And somewhere in those early years, in the classrooms, in the cold London evenings, in the unspoken silences between her parents, the seeds of the 5 unforgettable faces began to take root. Helen Mirren's rise into the world of theater and cinema was not a sudden burst of brilliance, but a slow, determined unfolding. The kind that begins quietly and grows with an intensity no one sees coming. In her early 20s, she walked into the National Youth Theater with the shy confidence of someone who wasn't yet certain of her place in the world, but who felt an undeniable pull toward the stage, as though some part of her had always been waiting for this moment. Those rehearsal halls, dim, dusty, echoing with half-formed performances, became her first sanctuary. She was not loud, nor was she showy. But the moment her feet touched the stage, a shift occurred, as though an invisible current moved with her. Directors noticed immediately. Something in her gaze held both distance and depth, like a woman who had lived far more than her years revealed. Even in silence, she emanated meaning. From the youth theater, she pushed herself toward the Royal Shakespeare Company, a world steeped in legacy, expectation, and pressure. The transition was anything but gentle. There were murmurs about her rawness, her unconventional training, her background. Some questioned her capability, others questioned her belonging. But Helen had inherited something from her childhood that few could rival, a quiet, relentless resilience. She studied obsessively. She rehearsed until her voice trembled. She dissected Shakespeare's women not as characters, but as living souls bound by history, desire, and pain. And with each performance, something sharpened within her, a clarity, a force, a truth she did not know she possessed. She didn't act, she inhabited. She didn't recite, she lived. Her early roles radiated the tension of someone who understood both strength and vulnerability intimately, someone who carried softness like a hidden blade. Her breakthrough wasn't marked by one moment, but by a series of performances that made the world pause. She played queens with fire, criminals with aching humanity, wounded women with a dignity that felt ancient. Critics who once dismissed her learned to watch her closely. Audiences who expected spectacle found themselves caught in the quiet gravity she created on stage and screen. Hollywood eventually called, but success brought not only opportunity, it brought pressure, scrutiny, and a kind of loneliness that clung to her between rehearsals and premieres. People saw her as regal, unshakable, iconic. But Helen carried insecurities that fame only magnified, fears of inadequacy, the old wounds of childhood, the hush of moments when those she trusted failed to hold their promises. And as her rise continued, so did the return of shadows she had tried to outrun. Faces she thought time had softened began to sharpen again in her memory. Betrayals she had buried beneath achievements resurfaced in unexpected ways. Her ascent was radiant, yes, but beneath its glow lived fractures she had learned to conceal. And it was within those fractures that the 5 unforgettable faces began to gather, waiting for the day she would finally name them. The fractures in Helen Mirren's life did not arrive with noise. They unfolded quietly, the way thin cracks begin inside old stone. Invisible at first, then deepening until the structure can no longer pretend to be untouched. Behind decades of poise, elegance, and mastery, Helen carried wounds born not of chaos, but of intimacy. And it was these wounds, subtle, personal, unexpectedly sharp, that shaped the woman she eventually became. The first rupture appeared early in her ascent, delivered by someone she trusted deeply, a mentor whose opinion once meant everything. His praise had guided her, steadied her, shaped her sense of belonging. But admiration turned sour the day she realized that his support came with limits. He dismissed opportunities she had earned, questioned choices he once encouraged, and spoke of her talent with a faint condescension disguised as guidance. It was a betrayal not of words, but of belief, and disbelief cuts deeper than cruelty. The second rupture came from friendship. Helen was never someone with many close friends, but those she held near, she held fiercely. One such friend, a woman who had been by her side through early auditions, heartbreaks, and cramped dressing rooms, began to grow distant. Success, Helen later understood, doesn't change people. It exposes the fractures already there. Small silences turned into coldness. Confidences once shared freely became ammunition in private conversations Helen was never meant to hear. The pain was not that the friendship ended, but that it dissolved so quietly, she wasn't sure when she had stopped being loved. A third rupture came through love. Helen gave her heart rarely, but when she did, she offered it with a vulnerability few ever saw. The relationship that meant the most to her fractured not through betrayal, but through absence. The slow, suffocating absence of someone who no longer showed up emotionally. Some goodbyes arrive with slammed doors. Others arrive with silence. Hers was the latter. A fourth rupture came later in life, one that surprised her precisely because it should not have. A collaborator she admired used her trust as leverage, repeating private doubts in public spaces, reshaping her vulnerability into weakness. It was a reminder that betrayal does not always come from enemies. These ruptures did not break Helen Mirren, but they carved her. And from those carved places, the 5 names she could never forgive began to take shape. Clearer, sharper, impossible to ignore. When Helen Mirren at 76 finally allowed herself to speak the 5 names she would never forgive, she did not do so with anger. There was no fire in her voice, no bitterness in her eyes. Instead, she spoke with a quiet exhaustion, the kind that settles in after a lifetime of carrying wounds that never fully close. These 5, she whispered, did not break me all at once. They broke me in fragments. And with that, the first name rose from the shadows. The mentor who praised her light but feared her rise. In her early years at the Royal Shakespeare Company, Helen admired a man whose approval meant more to her than she ever admitted. He nurtured her talent, spoke of her potential, and seemed to understand the fire inside her better than she did herself. But admiration can mask control. As Helen grew stronger, he began subtly clipping her wings, questioning her choices, discouraging certain roles, telling producers she wasn't ready when she absolutely was. It wasn't cruelty, it was fear disguised as care. He wanted her brilliance, but only if it stayed below his own. I forgave the doubt, Helen murmured. What I couldn't forgive was realizing he never wanted me to outgrow him. The friend who chose envy over sisterhood. There had been a friend, one of the few Helen had ever let into the softer chambers of her heart. They shared early struggles, cold dressing rooms, cigarettes behind theaters, and long nights of dreaming together. But as Helen's name began to rise, something shifted. Jokes became barbed, support became conditional. The closeness that once felt like home began to sour. The final rupture came when Helen discovered that this friend had been sharing her private insecurities in rooms she herself was not welcome in. Not in malice, but in envy. The quiet kind that corrodes affection from the inside. Envy, Helen said softly, is betrayal wearing the face of someone you loved. The love who left without the courage to say goodbye. Helen did not fall in love often, but when she did, it was with the full force of someone who had spent years guarding her heart. This particular love had felt safe, gentle, grounding, almost healing. But some departures arrived slowly. Words grew sparse. Moments grew quiet. He began shrinking away from her life with a softness sharper than any argument. And one morning, he simply didn't return. No cruelty, no explanation, just absence. I don't grudge him for leaving, she said. I grudge the way he left me holding questions he never answered. The collaborator who turned her vulnerability into a weapon. Later in her career, Helen trusted a collaborator she believed understood her artistry. Someone she confided in. Someone who saw her not as the dame or the icon, but as a woman who still carried the insecurities of her youth. In a moment of weakness, she shared her fears about aging, about relevance, about being forgotten in a world obsessed with newness. He later repeated those fears, not privately, but in a professional setting, with a tone that turned her vulnerability into critique. You can survive cruelty, Helen reflected. What you never forget is when someone uses your truth against you. Herself, the one she struggles most to forgive. The final name came after a long, trembling silence. The 5th, she whispered, is me. Not the public Helen, regal, brilliant, composed, but the Helen she hid even from herself. The girl who grew up believing she needed to stay silent to be loved. The woman who stayed in rooms where she should have walked away. The artist who doubted her worth even after the world placed crowns on her head. The human being who clung to people long after they had stopped holding her. I disappointed myself, she said quietly, more times than anyone else ever did. And yet, even as she spoke those words, there was a shift, a softening. She understood now that self-forgiveness is not absolution, but acceptance, and that the compassion she offered the world must finally be offered inward. These 5 shaped me, she said finally. They left scars, yes, but also strength, and perhaps something like wisdom. The night outside Helen Mirren's window deepened into a velvet blue. the kind of quiet darkness that softens everything it touches. She remained seated in the same stillness, her hands gently folded, as though the act of naming those 5 people had lifted a weight she had carried for far too many years. There was a calmness in her now, not relief, not triumph, but a quiet understanding that comes only when truth is finally spoken aloud. For decades, the world had seen her as unshakable, dignified, elegant beyond time. But beneath the luminous surface lived a woman who had endured, fractured, healed, and endured again. The 5 names she could not forgive were not symbols of bitterness. They were reminders, reminders of how deeply she had once cared, how fiercely she had once hoped, and how profoundly she had once been hurt. Yet in the soft glow of that evening, something unexpected settled inside her. Forgiveness, she realized, is not always a gift offered to others. Sometimes it is a boundary. Sometimes it is a declaration of self-worth. And sometimes it is simply the quiet decision to stop reopening old wounds. Helen understood now that the past would never fully disappear, but it no longer needed to define her steps forward. The scars remained, but so did the strength that grew around them, the wisdom shaped through them, and the dignity she had carried even in her darkest moments. As she sat in the dim amber light, a final question drifted through her mind. Gentle, persistent, honest. What do we owe the ghosts of our past once we finally learn to live without them? And who might we become when we decide that our story belongs to us alone?